Over several years, the Kirijo group pushes the boundaries of what anti-shadow suppression weapons could achieve, in hope of building the perfect machine to combat the threat of the shadows. Some succeeded, others were quietly shut down. This video walks through the full history of the anti-shadow suppression weapons developments, examining what works, what didn't, and the key reason the project didn't continue past a certain point. Before the idea of Android, before the discovery of Shadow, before the first human, there was something else. Something ancient. In a time long before history, a colossal alien collided with Earth. The impact was said to be so great that it split this being into two. Its body drifted off and eventually became the moon, but its psyche, its mind, remained behind. And left behind with it were fragments. Scattered across the Earth, these strange crystal-like pieces came from the alien itself. They shimmered with an energy that didn't match anything found in nature. But they wouldn't stay buried forever, because one day, someone would find them. In 1989, Koetsu Kirijo, head of the Kirijo Group, a globally operating multinational trading company, got a phone call. Something strange has been discovered. A stone, but not just any stone. According to the report, it might have the power to change the world as we know it. Over several years, the Kirijo Group conducted secret research into the object. What they discovered was hard to explain. The stone wasn't just emitting energy, it was behaving like a living thing. Yet, clearly, it wasn't one. It seemed to exist somewhere between matters and mind, mass and information. Some even believe it could distort time and space itself. Eventually, it would be called the plume, thus. But the story doesn't stop there. While experimenting with it, scientists accidentally opened what seemed to be a sealed pocket of space. And what they found inside changed everything. Creature, aggressive, unnatural, and clearly not of this world. This would later be called shadows. Over time, the researcher realized that the shadows share some core traits with the plume of dust itself, which meant the two were connected, and that even the power of the shadows itself could be harnessed. But while the plume could be studied safely, the shadows were hostile and dangerous to humans. Koetsu knew this couldn't be ignored, so he made a decision. Starting in 1995, one project would be dedicated to harnessing the power and learning more about the shadows directly. This would become known as the Shadow Experiments, and would be assigned to the new research lab built on Tatsumi Port Islands when it was completed. But Koetsu also knew the risks, so he authorized a second project, one designed as a safety measure, the Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapon project. This one would take place at the secluded facilities on Yakushima Island. Its purpose was simple but critical: to develop a weapon specifically designed to fight against Shadow in case of an outbreak. Two projects, one chasing possibilities, one prepare for what might come next. Within a couple of years, development at Yakushima facility was moving fast. However, the official records on the first three generations of anti-shadow suppression weapons are limited. Some documents were lost, others might have been erased. From the rumors and secondhand accounts we have gathered, it's believed these early models were designed more like combat vehicles. Their raw firepowers were said to be impressive, but they had one critical flaw: they couldn't summon persona. And without that abilities, they couldn't fulfill their main role to defeat the Shadow. As those early models were being phased out, the next stage of development was already taking shape. The fourth generation marked a turning point. After years of trial and error, researchers at Kirijo Group realized that awakening a persona would take more than just raw power. It needed something deeper. A sense of self, an ego. That's when the team began exploring something bold, giving these machines personalities, and to support that growth, they made another key decision, one that would change the course of the project. They redesigned the weapon to resemble humans. Because the more human they appeared, the easier for an ego to be developed. And with that came the potential to summon a persona. However, the Kirito researcher quickly realized that artificial personalities, when built from scratch, didn't grow. They couldn't respond to new experiences in any meaningful way. That's when someone suggested using the plume of dust as the foundation. Earlier, we talked about how the plume seemed to exist somewhere between matters and mind, mass and information. What that really meant was this. It could store data like a machine, but unlike machine, that data could change. It could grow when exposed to new information. Just like how human memories work. This made the plume of dust the perfect call for something entirely new, the personality module. But even with it, progress was slow. Ego development took too long. So the team made another decision. They injected personality data taken from a bedridden girl, her thought, her memories, her sense of self. All this was copied and used as a base, a shortcut. And it worked. The combination of the plume and this implanted personality gave the unit a real chance to grow, to evolve, to develop an ego. In terms of function, these androids were built for close-range combat due to the internal system wasn't stable enough for firearm. However, despite all the effort, none of the units from this generation was able to awaken a persona, even though they could develop a personality over time. This deeply disappointed the researcher. Frustrated by the slow progress and under pressure to deliver results, they began considering options that many would later call unethical. A few years has passed since the failure of the 4th generation Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapons to awaken a persona. Now, it's 1999, and something new is about to be activated. Unit number 031. The numbering of the A.S.S.W units has never been fully explained. We only have bits and pieces of data. But one thing was clear, Unit 031 was different. And it's carried the hope of the entire project. She wasn't just expected to be more emotionally responsive, she was also equipped for more advanced combat. Her primary weapons was a double-handed axe featuring integrated thruster, each capable of independent propulsions. This gave her swings both added powers and fine control. Additionally, her limbs and motor systems had been upgraded from previous generations, resulting in faster movement, improved stabilities, and increased physical durabilities over time. When Unit 031 was first activated, researchers immediately noticed something odd. Its speech has a subtle accent, something never programmed in. It was the first sign that ego development has already begun. Unit 031 was the first model to be equipped with full-size plume of dust, a far larger and more stable than any used in the 4th generation. So its early sign of personality didn't come out of nowhere. It was expected to show faster emotional growth, but even then, the speed surprised everyone. Shortly after activation, Unit 031 was placed into a battle chamber. This chamber was designed for one purpose: to push units to their limits. After the 4th generation failed to awaken a persona, researchers learned that extreme stress could increase the chances of triggering one. This led the Kirito group to adopt a more aggressive testing approach, placing A.S.S.W units in live combat trial against each other, creating life or death scenario. However, these tests weren't just about combat performance. Since metrics like awareness and consciousness were difficult to measure directly, survival itself became a proxy. If a unit survived, the researchers believe it might be more capable of awakening a persona and potentially more self-aware. Despite this effort, none of the units from the 4th generation were ever able to awaken a persona. However, today's result was different. Unit 031's performance stood out, defeating multiple sister units with little to no damage sustained. Her success renewed the team's confidence that, at last, the project might be moved in the right direction. Following each trial, the researchers collected the plume of dust from destroyed units. The data stored in these fragments would then be transferred to the surviving unit, enhancing its capabilities even further. But there was something that the team didn't anticipate. They believed they were transferring only combat data. Numbers, movement, reflex patterns. In reality, something else was also being transferred. After several successful trials, the research team made it official. Unit 031 was the first of a new generation. She was designated as the first complete 5th generation anti-suppression weapons. They named her Labrys after her weapons. However, despite Labrys completing multiple trials with minimal damage, and a clear sign of her strength, responsiveness, and advanced personality developments, there was still one missing piece. She had not awakened to a persona. To push her further, the research team scheduled another round of live combats. The hope was that increased stress would finally force a breakthrough. But this time, something was different. Visual and audio logs captured Labrys showing signs of hesitation. She paused before entering the combat chambers and was recorded issuing what appeared to be a verbal objections.
I don't want to fight him anymore.
This reluctance wasn't consistent with her previous behaviors. Her opponent for this trial was Unit 024, another long-running A.S.S.W. who had also survived numerous matches. Despite this, Unit 024 initiated combat as programmed. Records show that upon identifying the opposing unit, Labrys' hesitation intensified. The match itself was brief. Labrys quickly disarmed and disabled her opponent's mortar systems. But instead of finishing the job, she stopped. Then turned to the observation windows. She pledged, again, multiple times, for an alternative. Researchers note an urgent tone that suggested emotional resistance. This suggests emotional pushback prompted speculation among the research team. One theory pointed to the nightly field sessions, controlled outdoor routines where units were allowed limited freedom between trials. Official documentations describe this as low-priority environmental stimulations, designed to support emotional development through passive observation and social exposure. But logs reveal something more specific. Unit 031 and Unit 024 were often assigned to these sessions at the same time, frequently observed in close proximity and appearing to interact. At first glance, these routines appear therapeutic, an attempt to humanize the units. However, the events that follow raise another possibilities. By allowing units to form attachments, the research team may have been engineering emotional state. The more a unit bonds with another's, the greater the physical pressure when forced to fight them. And when that pressure became too much, it might serve as the very trigger needed for a persona to awaken. With that logic in mind, the researcher made a decision. An override protocol was issued for Unit 024, disabling her internal reasoning safeguards and forcing her back into combats. Labrys hesitated again, but this time, there was no avoiding it. She engaged and eliminated Unit 024 completely. Whether that final decision was calculated or emotional remained unclear. But what to come next would prove that the project's most powerful unit was also its most unpredictable. After the final combat trial, data recovery and transfer protocols resumed as usual. But within minutes of the transfer process, Labrys exhibited a visible change in behavior. Surveillance records show a clear liquid-like substance falling from her eyes, a reaction that closely resembled human tears. Researchers traced this event back to the data transfer. While combat data has always been the focus, it appeared that additional fragments, sentimental memories, and emotional imprints were also being passed along. This raised the possibility that such transfer has always included non-combat data, dating back to the earliest trials, though never in such an obvious and measurable forms. Disturbed by the reaction, the research team discussed erasing all non-essential memory data, especially sentimental contents, arguing it was unnecessary and possibly detrimental to the unit function as a weapon. According to the recorded audio, at least one researcher explicitly proposed deleting Labrys' sentimental memories. Immediately afterward, Labrys' combat system activated, despite the fact that there was no enemy unit nearby. She forced her way through multiple levels of the facilities, breaching containment barriers and damaging several structural sectors. Her route suggested a clear goal: escape. However, despite breaching the main interior, she was stopped at the island perimeters. The facility has been constructed with natural boundaries in mind, an ocean-locked site with limited access, chosen in part to prevent scenarios like this one. At the edge of the pier, Labrys ceased resistance. She surrendered without further incidents. Due to the damage she inflicted and unpredictable nature of her response, she was deemed unstable. The unit was deactivated. Her combats and personality data were archived and preserved to use in future generations. By February 2000, the 7th generation of Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapons was finally complete. This new model represented not just another iteration, but a major breakthrough, both technologically and conceptually. For the first time in the project's history, the design team moved beyond purely close combat weaponry. Built directly into the unit frames were arm-mounted guns, rocket-propelled fists, and shoulder-mounted missile launchers. Previous generations have avoided ranged weapons due to the hardware and software limitation. But now, with major upgrades across the board, the 7th generation could handle the precision, control, and stress required for integrated firearms. Mobility was also another leap forwards. New thruster system allowed the short-range flight and fast acrobatic maneuvers, giving the unit far more versatilities across different combat scenarios. Inside the core of this unit, researchers installed a radical new components: 2 full-size plumes of dust, integrated into a cross-shaped configurations. When activated, their overlapped energy signatures resemble the wings of a butterfly. Inspired by this image, the team named the components the Papillon Hearts. Papillon being the French word for butterfly. However, this wasn't just a symbolic upgrade. The Papillon Heart dramatically improved emotional cognitive growth, allowing the unit to stabilize its ego far more rapidly than any previous model. Combined with the memory data inherited from the earlier generation, including Labrys, the result was a unit that could develop a stable sense of self almost immediately. The 7th generation was also to awaken a persona through a natural emotional development. In previous generation, the Kirijo employed direct combat trial between sister units to induce the emotional stress necessary for persona developments. But with the combined stabilities offered by the Papillon Hearts and the accumulated memory data from earlier generation, this practice was no longer required. Instead, artifactually modified shadows were introduced as training opponents. This shift in strategy likely reflected the researchers' desire to avoid repeating past mistakes particularly the instability observed during Labrys' final trial. It was a major milestone. For the first time, emotional growth, memory integration, and machine evolution all work together cleanly. This unit proved that the Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapon project would finally achieve what it had set out to do from the beginning. Hardware improvements also made possible another major feature: all-gear mode. This special system temporarily removed all limiters on physical outputs, allowing the unit to operate at maximum powers for a short period of time. Speed, strength, and weapon discharge rates would spike dramatically during this phase. But it came at a cost. After each activation, the unit would overheat, forcing a full cooldown cycle before regaining normal functionality. When the time came to officially designate the new model, the researcher turned to mythology. The persona awakened by the 7th generation was Palladian, a sacred statue associated with Athena, the Greek goddess of wisdom and war. In Greek myth, the Aigis was Athena's shield, a symbol of protection and divine strength. And just like her mythological namesake, this new unit would serve as a protector, built to stand between humanities and the growing threat of shadows. Thus, she was given the name Aigis, marking the symbolic completion of her developments. However, while February 2000 is recorded as her official completion date in Kirijo Group internal documentation, it was not the date of her first activation. Records of Aigis' initial activation are fragmented, but many accounts suggest her first activation, often referred to as a test activation, took place sometime in 1999, only a few months after the deactivation of her sister unit, Labrys. This timeline has caused some confusion among researchers and analysts. Notably, there appear to be no clear gap in development timeline for a 6th generation unit. Several interpretations has been proposed. One suggests that the 6th generation was abandoned midway, possibly due to the instabilities observed in Labrys, prompting the Kirijo group to begin anew with the 7th generation. Another theory posits that the 6th generation may never have had a complete physical body, serving only instead as a transitional phase focused on hardware and software redesign to improve overall system stabilities. A third interpretation speculates that development of the 6th and the 7th generation may occur simultaneously alongside the 5th, based on the data logs indicating that Aigis was transported from Kagoshima Airport rather than being constructed directly on Yakushima Island. Shortly after her initial activation, a shadow outbreak occurred on Yakushima Island, and Aigis was deployed into live combat. Her performance during the incidents was impressive. She successfully eliminates the threats without sustaining critical damage. However, Headquarters soon made the decision to erase her memories. Despite fulfilling her mission parameters, Aigis shows signs of rapid emotional developments, not only during combat, but also through her interactions with residents of Yakushima Islands. While the Kirijo group had moved away from inducing extreme stress through internal combat trials, they still maintained a rigid view of the Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapons. These units were to function strictly as tools, and not individual. Any emotional growth beyond mission necessity was considered a liability. Thus, her emotional data was purged, and Aigis was placed into a standby, awaiting the next phase of her deployment. Approximately 1 year later, following the official completion of her final upgrades in February 2000, Aigis was reactivated once more. Her formal operation deployment began in September of that year. But her first true mission would prove far more challenging than anything she had previously encountered. In December 2000, one of the most catastrophic incidents in Kirijo Group history occurred. An explosion destroyed a major research facility on Tasami Port Island, the same facility responsible for the Shadow Experiment project. The collapse of the building reportedly resulted in the death of nearly all personnel on site. Worse yet, the incident triggered a large-scale shadow outbreak, including the escape of a particularly dangerous entity that would later be identified as Death. Aigis was immediately dispatched to contain the threat. The confrontation reached its climax on the Moonlight Bridge, when Aigis engages Death in a direct combat. Despite her best efforts, Aigis was unable to defeat the entity. The battle caused significant collateral damage, including mass civilian casualties on the bridge itself. However, she did not fail completely. In a critical decision, Aigis managed to seal Death inside a psyche of a young boy, one of the few survivors of the incident. It was an action that reflected both the purpose and the burden of her existence, to protect humanity at all costs. Following the confrontation, Aigis sustained extensive damage, particularly to her memory circuits. She was deactivated and placed into a long-term maintenance, where she would remain dormant until her eventually reawakening nearly a decade later. After Aigis was placed into a long-term maintenance following the Moonlight Bridge incidents, the Kirijo group briefly resumed developments on the Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapon project. At first, there was cautious optimism. The creation of Aigis has proven that stable operational units were possible, something that earlier generation has struggled to achieve. However, the optimism soon faded. Within a few months, a shift in leadership would alter the future of the project permanently. Takeru Kirijo succeeded Koetsu Kirijo as the new head of the organization. And with that change came a profound shift in priorities. The most decisive factor came from within the Kirijo family itself, the awakening of Mitsuru Kirijo's personas. Unlike the artificial constructs the company has been laboring to perfect, Mitsuru's abilities manifest naturally without extensive hardware, resource consumption, or the ethical complexity that had increasingly shadowed the A.S.S.W project. Faced with these new realities, the Kirijo group re-evaluated the project purpose, and several key factors ultimately led to its discontinuation. First, the emergence of natural persona user demonstrated that human operative could achieve the same result more efficiently, without the enormous infrastructure demands, psychological conditionings, and reliance on rare and finite resources, like the plume of dust. Second, the Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapon programs remain extraordinarily expensive. Developments, maintenance, training, and field losses has consumed vast resources, often with limited operational returns. Third, ethical concerns surrounding the project had grown louder within internal circles. And the case of Labrys, an android who demonstrates real emotional trauma, highlighted the unintended consequences of manufacturing artificial consciousness. The copying of human personalities, once seen as technological triumphs, was increasingly viewed as a moral failure. However, some internal records and retrospective accounts suggest that this shift was not without controversy. As the Kirijo group transitioned its focus toward training natural persona users, many of whom were still minors, critics pointed out an uncomfortable parallel. The organization had moved away from creating sentient machines, only to begin recruiting and experimenting with young human individuals instead. Although framed as a strategic and ethical improvement at the time, this transition raised new questions about the true nature of the risk and sacrifice being demanded in the fight against shadows. Under Takeharu's leadership, the Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapons project was formally discontinued. The research team was reassigned to other divisions and no new units were produced. However, a dedicated maintenance team was retained to keep Aigis operational, in case her deployment was ever needed again. Despite the official discontinuation of the Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapons project, scattered fragments of encrypted data suggest that development efforts may not have ended entirely. Among these findings, heavily encrypted file referenced what appeared to be the first male-type humanoid anti-shadow suppression weapons. This unit reportedly possesses the ability to transform between human and vehicle forms, and was capable of summoning a non-combative persona identified as Tsukuyomi. Interestingly, the model designation of this unit is listed as R00, a label that does not align with the numbering conventions of the original A.S.S.W series. Some interpretations suggest that this may point to a separate parallel project developed alongside the main Anti-Shadow Suppression Weapon initiative. And while the official history of the project appears to have reached its conclusion, traces of unfinished work remains. As is often the case with stories buried in secrecy, sometimes what seems like an ending is only the beginning of something else.